Perhaps no decade in American history began with such high expectations, nor ended with such feelings of disappointment, sadness, and anger as the 1960s. The decade began with the passing of the torch to a new generation of American leaders. This new generation was symbolized by the two men who ran for president in 1960. The Republican candidate, Richard M. Nixon, was only 46 years old, even though he had already served as vice president for 8 years. The Democratic candidate, Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts, was even younger, only 43. Kennedy won the election by less than 120,000 votes out of more than 68 million that were cast, and set forth on a program that became known as the New Frontier. A lot of mythology has grown up around John F. Kennedy and his administration. It's often referred to as Camelot, which takes its name from a very popular musical of the early 60s based on King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It is probably worth remembering, of course, that Camelot itself was a myth, and while many people still regard the Kennedy administration as a brief shining moment when all was well with the world, the fact is Kennedy actually accomplished very little during his 1,000 days in office, especially when it came to domestic policy. It's not that he didn't try. He proposed federal aid to education, medical care for the elderly, federal aid to the cities, but these and other reform proposals were all defeated by a conservative Congress. So Kennedy's domestic accomplishments were thus essentially those of style rather than substance. His words, if not his actions, stimulated Americans, especially younger Americans, to get moving again after the relative complacency of the Eisenhower years. One area of domestic policy that Kennedy was forced to take a more active role in was civil rights. We've already talked a little bit about the civil rights movement in the 50s. After Kennedy took office in 1961, the movement in many respects accelerated with the Freedom Rides in 1961, the beginning, of course, of the sit-in movement, which started in Greensboro, North Carolina in 1960, the founding at Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina, also in 1960, of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC. And then the pace of change really picked up in 1962 and 63. In 1962, the governor of Mississippi, Ross Barnett, tried to prevent the enrollment of African-American Air Force veteran James H. Meredith into the University of Mississippi. Kennedy sent federal marshals and ultimately National Guardsmen to Ole Miss to protect Meredith while he enrolled, but violence broke out. Then, in the spring of 1963, Martin Luther King organized a mass demonstration in Birmingham, Alabama. King, by this point, had come to realize the importance of television, and so he selected his targets, usually choosing cities in which he knew that the authorities would likely overreact. The police commissioner of Birmingham, Eugene Bull Connor, had a well-deserved reputation for being heavy-handed, and so when the Birmingham protest march took place in the spring of 1963, Connor's police did attack the demonstrators with police dogs, high-pressure fire hoses, tear gas, clubs, cattle prods, etc. This violence was shown all over the world on television, and that was the whole point, because remember, the United States is now representing itself as the leader of the free world, and this type of thing played right into the hands of the Soviet Union. King himself, I believe, was somewhat shocked at how violent the reaction was in Birmingham, and one person who watched it on television was President Kennedy, who confessed to being physically ill when he saw a police dog biting a young boy in the stomach. June 11th, 1963 is an important date in the history of the civil rights movement. On the morning of June 11th, the segregationist governor of Alabama, George Wallace, stood in the doorway of the admissions office at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, which was the last major segregated university in America, in an attempt to prevent African American students from enrolling. Wallace backed down when federal marshals showed up. Later that evening, President Kennedy went on national television, proclaimed civil rights to be a moral issue, and called for passage of a strong civil rights bill. This was seen as very significant because it meant that for the first time the Kennedy administration had finally taken a strong stand in favor of civil rights. However, later that evening, in Jackson, Mississippi, Medgar Evers, leader of the Mississippi chapter of the NAACP, returned home after watching Kennedy's address to the nation, and as he got out of his car, he was shot and killed in the driveway of his own home. After that, Kennedy did attempt to get his civil rights bill through Congress, but he was unable to do so because of a conservative bloc of Republicans and very conservative Southern Democrats. In fact, much of the opposition to civil rights came from within Kennedy's own party. In August of 1963, in order to put pressure on Congress to pass the Civil Rights Bill, you had the famous March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The idea of a March on Washington went back to the 1940s, but it finally took place on August 28, 1963. Hundreds of thousands of people showed up to participate in the peaceful demonstration, and of course the crowning moment of the event was Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. There is no doubt that the March on Washington was one of the great moments in the history of the civil rights movement, and in fact, in many ways, in the history of modern America. However, as many liberals pointed out, including Senator Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, while the March on Washington represented all that was good about America, it did not change one single vote in Congress. And so by the time of Kennedy's assassination on November 22nd, 1963, the Civil Rights Bill was going absolutely nowhere. What finally got the act passed in 1964 was a new president, a Southerner, Lyndon Baines Johnson of Texas, who used his considerable political skills that Kennedy did not necessarily possess, to get the bill through Congress. One reason Kennedy was not more successful in terms of domestic policy is that for most of his 1,000 days in office, he was consumed with foreign policy. Kennedy's nightmare, in many ways, was the Cold War, which in the early 1960s, for reasons that are still not fully understood, was probably at its height. For one thing, by the early 60s, both the United States and the Soviet Union possessed enough nuclear weapons to completely destroy each other and most of the world many times over. This was referred to with the acronym MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction. In many respects, mutually assured destruction probably did more to keep the world at peace during the nuclear age than anything else, but it was certainly a dark cloud that hung over the world. The Soviet leader at this point was Nikita Khrushchev, who, for reasons, again, that are still not fully understood, was acting in a very belligerent manner in the late 50s and early 60s. Among other things, Khrushchev sought a resolution of the long-standing Berlin issue. Berlin, of course, had been a divided city since the end of World War II, but it was not until 1961 that communist authorities began constructing a concrete and barbed wire wall to separate the free western part of the city from the communist eastern part. The Berlin Wall, of course, was not put up to keep anybody out, but rather it was put up to keep people from leaving. As soon as the wall went up, some of Kennedy's advisors told him he had to have it torn down immediately. He decided not to do that because it would be too provocative, but in 1963 he did go to Berlin and gave a famous speech in which he reaffirmed America's commitment to the freedom of West Berlin and ended with the memorable words, "Ich bin ein Berliner," "I am a Berliner," basically meaning that, as he put it, all free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And from the time it went up in 1961 until it started to come down in November of 1989, the Berlin Wall was probably the most famous and visible symbol of the Cold War. Kennedy's greatest foreign policy crisis came in Cuba. While Eisenhower was still in office, Fidel Castro had overthrown the longtime dictator Fulgencio Batista and had established close relations with the Soviet Union. An attempt to overthrow Castro early in Kennedy's administration resulted in disaster. This was the so-called Bay of Pigs fiasco, in which a force of anti-Castro Cuban exiles secretly trained by the CIA invaded Cuba. The whole operation was botched right from the beginning, and Kennedy received a lot of criticism in some quarters for allowing it to go forward in the first place, and in other quarters for not sending in American forces to rescue the Cuban invaders. Then, of course, in October of 1962, we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which is probably the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear war. High-altitude reconnaissance photographs reveal clearly that the Soviets were installing nuclear missiles in Cuba in a clear challenge to Kennedy and the United States. Kennedy and his advisors weighed their options, and he finally settled on a naval blockade of Cuba, or as he called it, a quarantine. He went on national television and announced to the American people and the world what the situation was, and with Soviet ships headed for Cuba with more missiles and more personnel, the world held its breath to see if the Soviet ships would honor the blockade and turn around, or if they would try to run it. If they made the latter choice, shooting would start, and no one knew where it would end, but it could very easily result in a nuclear holocaust. Fortunately, the Soviets backed down, and the crisis ended. In many people's eyes, Kennedy became a great hero for having taken such a strong stand. Others criticized him for pushing the world to a brink of a nuclear war. In many ways, the Cuban Missile Crisis shocked both sides. Neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev really expected things to go as far as they did. And one positive result of the crisis, other than the fact that we didn't end up with World War III, of course, was the establishment of the so-called hotline between Washington and Moscow, so that in the future, the leaders of the two countries could communicate in a more direct fashion than was possible during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Also, the Cuban Missile Crisis probably gave a boost to the signing in 1963 of the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was very limited, but at least began a reduction in above-ground nuclear testing. Finally, there was the situation in Vietnam, another situation that Kennedy inherited from his predecessors. Kennedy's legacy on Vietnam is mixed. He sent a lot of mixed signals. At times, he seemed to indicate that he had no intention of expanding America's role in Vietnam, and perhaps he even intended to reduce the American presence in Vietnam. But at other times, he sent the message that, just like his predecessors, Truman and Eisenhower, he would not allow any country in any world region to fall to communism for fear that the entire region would fall. So about the best we can say about Kennedy's policy with regard to Vietnam is that when he took office in January of 1961, there were 2,000 American military advisors in South Vietnam. At the time of his assassination on November 22, 1963, the number of American personnel in Vietnam was up to 16,000. On the other hand, there were still no American ground combat troops in the country. So the Americanization of the Vietnam War and the commitment of ultimately 500,000 American combat troops would be made by Kennedy's successor, Lyndon B. Johnson.